Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? What is the story and inspiration behind the early civil rights movement? And did the pastors and religious leaders of America play a role in the abolition of slavery? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shaped the lives of these great black men and women? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
When God tells history in the Bible, He doesn't gloss it up. He tells it just the way that it happened. He tells the good, the bad, the ugly.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
There's no way you can separate political parties from black history unless you want to be politically incorrect, and then that requires a sacrifice of the truth. And I'm not going to do that.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
Nearly every Southern Republican Party was started by blacks, not whites.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
The history of black Americans begins in 1619 when the first load of slaves sailed up the James River into Jamestown, Virginia, slavery introduced into America. The first history of African Americans is involuntary. For the next 150 years, black American history is really centered around the states because we don't have a nation, we don't have any kind of a national government. It's very much like it would have been in Europe. All the different states were really like nations. So the first real concerted national effort to end slavery occurs with the beginning of the national government. The first efforts to end slavery really began in 1787 when they had the Constitutional Convention. All the states have come together and then trying to figure out how do we have a nation now. And within that group, you had some pro-slavery, you had a lot of anti-slavery.
Right.
Overwhelming majority of states were anti-slavery, but some were pro-slavery. But again, they were just states back then, so they couldn't affect their neighbor. They could end it in their state, and they did. When we signed the Declaration of Independence, a number of states started wiping out slavery right then. We had to have slavery before that because the king would not allow us to end slavery. Well, now that we separate from Great Britain, we can end slavery. So here you have Massachusetts, and you have Vermont, and you have Connecticut, and all these states ended slavery. Now they're in this federal constitutional convention with some states that are pro-slavery, with a whole bunch that are anti-slavery. There was a lot of fight that went over that. One of the clauses in the Constitution to which critics today point to say slavery is part of the Constitution, always had been, it's part of the national psyche, always been this attitude of enslaving African Americans. They point to what's called the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause was actually an anti-slavery clause that was put in the Constitution. But we never hear that today. We never hear that 3/5 was anti-slavery. But it's interesting, the testimony of those who would know best, the ones that I would look to if I wanted to know what African Americans thought about the 3/5 clause, I'd go to somebody like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, great civil rights leader. We know him from back around 1838. He escaped from slavery and he went to New York, and as he was against slavery in New York, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society heard him speak and said, oh, you need to go on the road full time and speak against slavery. So here's Frederick Douglass, who had been in Maryland a slave, has now escaped to the North, he's free. So he goes on the road full time to speak against slavery. Now, interestingly, in the 2 years that he was in New York, what's called the radical abolitionists were the ones who trained him. And they said the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. It is filled with the Founding Fathers' desire to keep slavery. He had been trained in that for 2 years. But when he agreed to go on the road full time for the Massachusetts Abolition Society, he had the integrity to say, you know, I've been taught about these documents, but I better read them for myself.
Wow.
And so he went back and read the documents, he read the debates, he read all the things that went on. In his autobiography, he said that he underwent a radical change of opinion. Instead of finding that the documents were pro-slavery, he said he found them to be anti-slavery in every provision.
Wow.
He said, by the way, if they are pro-slavery, why does the word slave or slavery, why does none of that appear anywhere in the Constitution? And they don't appear. In the 1860 presidential election, there was a split in the Democratic Party, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Both factions supported slavery, but while Southern Democrats were willing to split the United States to form their own nation, Northern Democrats refused to do so. Northern Democrats voted for Stephen Douglas for president, while Southern Democrats voted for John C. Breckinridge. With this split in the Democratic vote, Republican Abraham Lincoln was then elected with only 40% of the popular vote, but 59% of the Electoral College vote. Republicans also won a majority in the U.S. House and Senate in that election, thus giving Republicans control of the lawmaking process for the very first time. Given the bold anti-slavery and pro-civil rights positions set forth by Republicans in their platforms, it was obvious to Democrats what was about to occur. The anti-slavery and pro-civil rights position of the Republicans were about to become reality. What was the Democratic response? Southern Democrats left Congress and took their states with them, forming a nation that described itself as the slave-holding Confederate States of America. While Northern Democrats did not support secession, they nonetheless generally supported slavery and opposed civil rights for black Americans. In short, the main difference between Southern and Northern Democrats at that time was their view on secession, not slavery. However, returning to the election of 1860, with Republicans firmly in control of the federal government, they quickly began implementing significant changes. In 1862, Republicans abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in the southern states in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation was eagerly anticipated, and many black Americans gathered in groups around clocks or watches, eagerly awaiting the arrival of midnight on December the 31st, 1862, for the proclamation was to take effect on the first moment of January the 1st, 1863. Frederick Douglass was in attendance at one such midnight rally, waiting for the proclamation to become official. When that moment arrived, a celebration erupted, and Douglass exclaimed,
"It was one of the most affecting and thrilling occasions I ever witnessed, and a worthy celebration of the first step on the part of the nation in its departure from the bondage of the ages."
In 1860, in that election where the Democrats had their platform, said Dred Scott's great, Republicans had theirs, says no it's not. You had the election that time between the Democrats and the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln running as a Republican. The Democrats actually broke and split. There was the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats said slavery is absolutely fine and we're willing to leave the Union if these Republicans try to end slavery. You had the Northern Democrats up through New York and elsewhere that said, we think slavery's fine, but we're not willing to break up the Union over it. So when he gets elected, the Southern Democrats said, we told you we're going to leave if he gets elected, because if he gets elected, he's promised to end slavery. So you had 11 Democrat states secede from the Union. Now, we now say the South seceded from the North. No, no, no. Every Southern Democrat in the House, every Southern Democrat in the Senate left and started a new nation. I have the founding documents of that nation. They call it the slave-holding nation of the Confederacy. That's in their title. The speech given by their Vice President, Alexander Stephens, said that slavery is the cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy. So you have 11 states that have broken away to have a slave nation. That's what the Civil War is about. So now Republicans, in one election, not only was Abraham Lincoln elected, but Republicans took the House and the Senate in one election. So within 7 years, they've gone to be in the majority party. They started cranking out civil rights laws like crazy. This is one of the early civil rights laws. This is a law to secure equality before the courts. In other words, race no longer had anything to do with the courts. It was prior to this that if you were black, you couldn't testify in court, you couldn't go before a court to bring a suit, you were excluded from the legal process. Here's a bill that's designed to give equal pay for soldiers. If you're black or if you're white, you're going to get paid the same.
What are the dates of these?
This bill is 1864. This is March the 5th of 1864.
And is that an original?
That's the original. This is the original as introduced in the Senate. This is Senate Bill 145. And this is the original Senate bill. Here's the House bill. This is H.R. 51. This is the bill that created the Freedmen's Bureau, another civil rights bill. So Republicans are cranking out civil rights bills like crazy.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
There was indeed a clear difference between the philosophy of the Republicans and of Democrats on the issue of race and racial equality. Southern Democrats had been willing to form an entire nation on the foundation of white supremacy, and there was no doubt that the South was strongly Democratic. As a leading South Carolina Democrat testified during an 1871 congressional hearing,
for the purposes of this hearing, sir, could you provide a breakdown along party lines as exists in your state?
Almost 999 out of 1,000 of the decent people of South Carolina belong to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is composed entirely of the colored people.
when it came time for the presidential election of 1864, Southern Democrats were still fighting against the Union. Therefore, the presidential candidate for the Democrats that year was a Northern Democrat, Union General George B. McClellan. McClellan was actually running for president against his own commander-in-chief, but there was a clear difference between the two. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had twice replaced McClellan for failing to obey Lincoln's orders to launch aggressive attacks against the Confederacy. And not surprisingly, the anti-black tone of this Northern Democrat shone through in his presidential campaign. For example, examine this 1864 campaign piece for General McClellan. Why does he urge citizens to vote for him? Because, as he explains,
our bloody Civil War has now lasted nearly 4 years under the mismanagement of Abraham Lincoln. Nearly 1 million white men have been sacrificed.
Notice another of his complaints.
Lincoln has declared his intention to convert the Civil War into a war for forcible abolition and Negro equality, social and political.
According to McClellan, since white lives were being lost, and since Republicans were seeking both abolition and Negro equality, McClellan argues that he, as a Democrat, should be elected so that he could halt those policies. Republicans also took clear positions in that 1864 presidential campaign. The 1864 Republican platform therefore called for a constitutional amendment to completely abolish slavery, and work was begun in Congress almost immediately on that amendment. That same year, President Lincoln won re-election to a second term. It was in 1865 that the Civil War finally came to a close. The nation of slaveholding states had been defeated. President Lincoln and the black troops of the 29th Connecticut Regiment visited Richmond, the former capital of the Confederate States of America. An officer in that black regiment recorded the scene.
As the president passed along the street, the colored people waved their handkerchiefs, hats, and bonnets and expressed their gratitude by shouting repeatedly, "Thank God for his goodness. We have seen his salvation." The white soldiers caught the sound and swelled the numbers, cheering as they marched along. All could see the president. He was so tall. One woman shouted, "Thank you, dear Jesus, for this sight of the great conqueror." No wonder tears came to the president's eyes when he looked on the poor colored people who were once slaves and heard the blessing uttered from thankful hearts and thanksgiving to God and Jesus. Thousands of colored men in Richmond would have laid down their lives for President Lincoln.
You're proving to us the mindset of founding fathers.
Yes.
We're moving into the mid-1800s, but the intent and the original intent based upon fact of original documents sitting right here on this set right now.
Well, that's why they called themselves the Republican Party. They wanted to go back to the original intent. They wanted to go back to the founding. And so they believed all of these laws were consistent with what the founders had tried to do in those early laws.
Wow.
So this is a reflection of original intent, even though it's 70 years later.
We had moved away 70, 80 years. We had moved really far away from the original intent of the Founding Fathers, and this was a correction of that pendulum.
That's right.
moving. Yeah.
That 35 years in Congress from 1820 to 1854, 1855, Democrats were reversing a lot of the early laws. They said, you know, George Washington said no slavery in federal territories. We don't like that law. You know, 1808 at that time under Thomas Jefferson, Congress passed this law that said no more slave trade. We don't like that law. So they went through and take all these laws that were passed early federal Congresses by the Founding Fathers and said, we disagree with all that. We're going a different direction.
Wow.
So it's a complete reversal. So the Republican Party says, no, we're going back to the principles of the Republic. That's why they call themselves Republican Party. So there was a period of time we got away. Now we're headed back. And significantly, we come to an election in 1864 while we're still at war. Now, what's interesting is all these Southern Democrats have seceded and formed their own state. So it's going to be pretty easy to guess who's going to win the election. I mean, the Republicans now have the majority because they're still in the Union. This is a significant document right here. It's a very delicate document, if I can pick it up. This is a platform of the Republicans and the Democrats in 1864. That little jewel right there sets forth the Republican platform and the Democrat platform. But what makes this significant, this is the first document that called for a constitutional amendment to end slavery.
Oh my goodness.
See what happened? They said, well, we're passing all these civil rights laws, but it's just taking too long. Let's just get a constitutional amendment and stop this thing right now.
And what year was that?
This is 1864. You see, what happened as a result of this election, Republicans got back in power, and they promptly introduced the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. So they're put back in power, they promised to do it, and they introduced the 13th Amendment, and significantly, they voted on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery while the Civil War is still going on. So we're talking in January and February of 1865, they have the vote in the House and the Senate to abolish slavery. Now, at that time, there were 200 members of Congress, Democrat and Republican, because at that time you still had all the Northern Democrats in. So all the Northern Democrats are still in Congress. Southern Democrats have their own nation now. Northern Democrats still in. So you got Northern Democrats and Republicans, 200 members of Congress. 137 members voted to abolish slavery. When they voted, shortly after the vote, this was produced nationally. This right here is a picture of all 137 members of Congress who voted to abolish slavery, everyone. And it's got Abraham Lincoln right at the center because he was leading the charge on the 13th Amendment. Now, under the Constitution, a president has no role in a constitutional amendment.
Wow.
The president does nothing. This is the only constitutional amendment in American history signed by a president of the United States. He did it symbolically to say, I know I've got nothing to do with passing the amendment officially, but I want you to know I'm behind this. So he signed it. Now, at that time, you had 118 members of Congress that were Republican. You had 82 members of Congress that were Democrat. As it turns out, 118 out of 118 Republicans voted to end slavery. Only 19 out of 82 Northern Democrats voted to end slavery. So that's why you only have 137. You see, you have 23% of Democrats in the North who want to end slavery. 3/4 didn't, but you have 100% of Republicans who want to end slavery. So the 13th Amendment is passed, it goes to the states, it is ratified.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
When the vote had been taken in Congress on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the chambers had been packed from wall to wall with expectant observers. When the numbers were counted and it was announced that the amendment had passed, a roar erupted from the thousands in the chamber. Hats were thrown and voices were raised in exuberant cheers. Congress had voted to end slavery. How should something that profound be celebrated? Members of the House asked that a sermon be preached to commemorate the event. And whom did they ask to preach the sermon? The Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Garnett became the first African American to speak in the halls of Congress, and he delivered this sermon. Today, it may sound strange to hear that there was a sermon preached in the Capitol. In fact, on December the 4th, 1800, shortly after Congress first moved into the Capitol building, Congress authorized that on Sundays, the Capitol would be used for church services. By 1867, the largest church in Washington, D.C. was the one that met inside the U.S. Capitol. Reverend Garnett preached this sermon on Sunday, February the 12th, 1865, and it was powerful. He began that sermon with a recollection of his own personal experiences.
What is slavery? Too well do I know what it is. I was born among the cherished institutions of slavery. My earliest recollection of parents, friends, and the home of my childhood are clouded with its wrongs. The first sight that met my eyes was my Christian mother enslaved.
Garnett then reviewed the prominent historical leaders of both church and state who had strongly opposed slavery.
The other day, when the light of liberty streamed through this marble building and the hearts of a noble band of patriotic statesmen leaped for joy, in this, our national capital, shook from foundation to dome with the shouts of a ransomed people. Then methinks the spirits of Washington, Jefferson, the Jays, the Adams, and Franklin, and Lafayette, and Giddings, and Lovejoy, and those of all the mighty and glorious dead remembered by history because they were faithful to truth, justice, and liberty, were hovering over this august assembly. Though unseen by mortal eyes, doubtless they joined the angelic choir and said, Amen!
So now for states to come back in to the United States, these 11 southern states that broke away to have a slave nation to get back in, this is the oath of loyalty you had to take to get back in to the United States. To come into the United States, you have to swear before Almighty God, number one, that you will obey the laws pertaining to civil rights and slavery and the new constitutional amendments, and two, that you'll uphold the Constitution of the United States, which now has the 13th Amendment in it. And by the way, to show you how serious they took the oath, they didn't take an oath on the Bible. They didn't just raise the right hand and say, so help me God. They take an oath on the holy evangelist of Almighty God. You see, we know that when we put our hands on the Bible, we're putting it on the Gospels. That's Jesus Christ. We claim to be a Christian nation. Wow. We're swearing on Jesus Christ, whom we claim to follow, that we will obey the Constitution, and we're swearing on the Gospels that we will obey the civil rights laws. This was a serious oath. I mean, this is the official document put out by the United States, and you're swearing on the holy evangels of Almighty God. Now, the various states would put out this document as well, but I mean, this is part of our history. Yeah. Wow. So, because of the 13th Amendment, for the first time, African Americans across the South are free. Now, they were freed in the Emancipation Proclamation, but South is pretty much ignoring that. So now we got a constitutional amendment, and you're swearing you're going to uphold the Constitution. So now you got to recognize blacks are free. Because they were free, they could register to vote. They started registering to vote. They started electing blacks to office across the South like crazy. Because of the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery, black Americans, particularly in the South, could now enjoy their first real taste of civil rights, their first genuine opportunity for political participation. Within a year, blacks were registering to vote and were forming political parties across the South. For example, at a rally in Houston, Texas, on July the 4th, 1867, 150 blacks and 20 whites formed the Republican Party of Texas. And black Americans also started other Southern Republican parties as well. For a few years, Republicans became the political majority in most of the Southern states. Those Republican legislatures moved quickly to protect voting rights for African Americans, prohibit segregation, establish public education, and to open public transportation, state police, schools, and other institutions to black Americans. Not only were the Southern legislatures at that time Republican, but at least for a few years, nearly every Southern legislature included many black legislators. In fact, the first 42 blacks elected to the state legislature in Texas were all Republicans. And in Louisiana, the first 95 black representatives and the first 32 black senators were, again, all Republicans. Similarly, in Alabama, the first 103 blacks elected to the state legislature were all Republicans. In Mississippi, the first 112 black legislators were Republicans.
In South Carolina, the first 190. In Virginia, the first 46. In Florida, the first 30, and the same in North Carolina. And in Georgia, 41 blacks were elected to the state legislature, all as Republicans.
the Republican Party of Texas was founded in Houston on the 4th of July, 1867, by 150 blacks and by 20 whites. Nearly every Southern Republican Party was started by blacks, not whites. Well, of course, in those states, they're opposing this, that the racists are really out, and Democrats are saying this is not fair. And because they would not recognize the civil rights laws, even though they swore to do so, that's why the 14th Amendment was passed. The 14th Amendment says every freed slave now has the rights of citizenship of every other citizen. Because in the South, southern states are saying, well, those blacks might be freed, but they're sure not citizens of our state. Well, the 14th Amendment says, oh, yes, they are. Wow. Any right of citizen. And because of the 14th Amendment, we can now elect blacks to the federal Congress. These guys right here. That's the first 7 blacks elected to the federal Congress, right there. This guy is the first black U.S. Senator, Hiram Rhodes Revels. Oh, dare I say, he's a preacher of the gospel. He was a missionary, he was a chaplain in the Civil War, he raised 3 black regiments for the Union Civil War, he went on to become the president of Alcorn College. And over on this side, really cool guys, Robert Brown Elliott, Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey, by the way, is the first black elected to the House of Representatives. He actually served as Speaker of the House. A black served as Speaker, yeah. All 7 of these guys are Republicans. Matter of fact, the first 23 blacks elected to the federal Congress were all Republicans. Now, you want to get embarrassed, there is a great website called Neglected Voices. Neglected Voices are the speeches of the first 23 blacks who served in Congress. Now, half of these guys have been educated in a 5-year period, and they were self-educated. They taught themselves. I'm embarrassed to read those speeches because it takes me a dictionary to understand what they're saying. Their word level, their vocabulary level, their syntax, sentence structure, way over anything I would ever think about saying or doing. I get so inspired reading these guys. I mean, here they are. 5 years ago, they're slaves. Now they're members of Congress, and you read their speeches, and it'll throw you through the roof. It'll lift you right off your chair to see what these guys did. Unbelievable. 4 of these guys became university presidents. Half of them became teachers. Several were pastors. I mean, it's unbelievable what these guys did in a short period of time. Wow. And we never hear that today. So that aspect of American history that deals with ending slavery and starting forward progress for African Americans, wonderful time in history, filled with wonderful individuals who fought. There's a lot of tragedy involved, but there's a lot of victory involved, and these guys are representative of that time. It's a wonderful time in American history.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.